Hello, folks. I'm Joshua Gonzalez, the Education Director at Abundant Housing LA, and this is Housing 101. We haven't done a Housing 101 in a few months. We used to do it every other month, and we decided that we're gonna change that cadence a little bit, and we're gonna start to do something a little special with these Housing 101s. And so that involves uh, picking a sort of highlighted topic that has to do with housing and bringing on some guests to give us the expertise that we need to be the best advocates that we can be, right? So I'm going to get us started. We have a little slide deck we're going to share. Our guests are going to introduce themselves in a bit. And thank you, everyone who is here today and who will be watching this in the future. I am talking to you too. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let me get this going. Going to share the screen. Oh, I had it on the wrong tab. There we go. Okay, so there. Let me get this going. Okay, can everyone see this all right? Yes. A nod from someone. I can't really see anyone right now. I can only see
Yep,
Cat.
we
Can you give me a
we can
nod?
see we can see the whole browser window.
Oh, well,
So it
I mean
works.
that's yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Let me oh, I lost my other thing. Desktop has so many things. Alrighty, so this is Housing 101, addressing climate change. Yes, today's June 8th. And I am Joshua again, and our guests are Chris Ree and Catherine Baltazar. And let's get started. So, the first thing that we like to do when we're talking about housing is we want to do a land acknowledgement. So, Abundant Housing LA recognizes and acknowledges the first people of this ancestral and unceded territory. It belonged to the Tongva and Gabrielino people, and the land is now occupied where I live specifically by State Senate District 26 and City Council District 1. We acknowledge and honor Indigenous folks' elders, past and present, and their descendants. We recognize that the Tongva peoples are still here, and we are committed to lifting up their stories, culture, and community. The first peoples of this nation ensured every member of the community had a home. We share a fundamental human responsibility to ensure that as the people who came after, we can say the same. Abundant Housing LA. Well, first, if you'd like to learn more, you can go to either of these links that are up there. We will be sharing the slide decks with everyone. But if you'd like to find out, most people in Southern California have the same sort of information. But if you'd like to find out exactly the first peoples that were in your area where you live, you can go to native-land.ca. And if you'd like to learn more about the Tongva and Gabrielino tribe, you could go to gabrielinotribe.org. Lots of cool stuff to learn there, lots of good information. So, Abundant Housing LA. What does Abundant Housing LA do? Well, our mission is to address the upstream causes of the housing crisis and housing shortage and build a movement for structural change so that LA becomes a place of abundant housing. So, why is that important? Well, there are many reasons, but today let's talk about two of them that are really relevant to all the stuff we're going to be going through today. So, first, abundant housing is important for environmental sustainability. Imagine if people could live near where they work, could walk, bike, and access transit. It would mean less sprawl, which you'll learn about also, and destruction of the environment, more energy efficient buildings, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Abundant housing also helps to adapt to the growing fire risk. With the future of fire in this state, we need to move a lot of people very quickly out of fire hazard areas and into sustainable communities. That means building a lot of high density housing as fast as possible. So, we seek to achieve abundant housing through advocacy, policy, and education to shift LA culture around housing. We hope you'll be part of this effort. We do things like show up to city council meetings, we planning commission meetings, we submit support letters, we address policy issues, and we have happy hours. Every month we have happy hours, which are really fun and a really great opportunity to learn more and get to know folks in a casual way. So I hope that you'll be a part of that going forward. And I'm forgetting to move the slide forward because that's what I do. I start talking and I forget to move the slide. Um, so I'd like to go ahead and let our first guest introduce himself. Please have at it, Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Saturday. My name is Chris Reeve. My pronouns are he, him. I am a proud member of Abundant Housing. I am also here today as a volunteer board member with Urban Environmentalists, which is a grassroots organization that focuses specifically on sustainable, human-centered, and just communities through land use policy reform. So we're very, very interested in the intersection between housing, climate change, and other environmental issues. We have a chapter here in Los Angeles and sister chapters in the San Francisco Bay Area and Chicago. And as for me, this is a picture of my family, which I thought would be nice to include. My wife and I and our two dogs live in Eagle Rock. We live in a small lot home, which for folks in the LA housing circles, this is a very unique typology to the city of Los Angeles. It looks a lot like townhomes. And this is just a picture from a block party that my neighbors held recently. So the driveway was kind of intentionally designed in a way that could be shared public space. So you'll see kids learning how to ride their bikes out here. It's closed to most traffic, so it's very low traffic, and you'll see kids out there. You'll see people set up. We have parties every once in a while. I've also previously lived in Koreatown and spent some time in New York City, Boston, and San Francisco. I am an independent sustainability consultant professionally. I'm trained as an urban planner and as an energy manager. I'm a second generation Korean American. My mother's family immigrated to Koreatown in the 70s. And I think I'll pass it off to Kat from here.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. And thanks, Joshua. I'm really happy to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation for us to be here and represent a little bit of the climate side. I work for Climate Resolve, and we help build like collaborations between connecting like communities, organizations, policymakers. Climate change is a really big problem. It's a global problem, and it takes a lot of collaboration, a lot of work for us to be able to tackle it. And some of the areas of work that we do focus a lot on like keeping cool. So extreme heat is a big focus area of ours. We do a lot of work with transportation, conservation, working with communities on advocacy, informing them, and also empowering them to be part of the change and be part of the advocacy that we do. And then, of course, we're always doing science. We're always doing research to make sure that the different things that we're proposing and trying to use as solutions are actually working and doing what they need to do. And so, a little bit about me. I use Shay. Wow, I put them together. Shay. She and they pronouns. I'm the policy analyst and organizer. I was born and raised in the Westlake neighborhood of LA. Now I live in Long Beach, trying to enjoy the like slow living type of side. First generation Guatemalan. My father is a Cajoal Mayan from Guatemala, and then my mom is from Huehuetenango. It's like big city girl. Um, I do a lot of work around like transportation, specifically the intersection between transportation, housing, urban greening, because I dream of seeing our BIPOC communities be resource rich and then have what they need to continue like cultural and historical legacies that have been existing for a very long time, and making sure that their environments match those legacies that they've built over the years. So that's just me. I'm a big dreamer.
Thank you so much. You're both amazing. Okay, so um this is what our agenda looks like today. We just did the introduction part. We'll be going into historical context and current challenges, environmental impacts of housing, climate science and urban settings, practical climate resilience solutions, and lastly, we'll have a little bit of a joint discussion where there will be Q&A. We want to hear from y'all too, where we talk about housing as a climate strategy. So I'll get us going with historical context and current challenges. So, exclusionary housing policies. What are they? It's kind of like, okay, what does that mean? Well, exclusionary housing policies are rules that kept or keep certain people, often minorities, from living in certain neighborhoods. These policies include racially restrictive covenants, redlining, and zoning laws. And we'll get into what those are in the next couple of slides. These policies caused segregation and inequality, making it harder for everyone to have a fair chance at good housing. So, understanding these policies helps us to see why it's important to support fair housing for all today, and also to address the climate change because there is environmental racism and disparities as well. So, let's talk about racially restrictive covenants. So, in Los Angeles, racial covenants were agreements written into property deeds that stopped homeowners from selling their homes to people of certain races, like African Americans, Latine, Asians, and other minorities. These rules were used to keep neighborhoods segregated. So, for example, in the 1900s, many homes, and the 1900s is not that long ago, so let's be real clear about that. But I know it seems like maybe a way back for some of us, but it's not that long ago. So in the 1900s, many homes in Los Angeles had deeds, as you'll see in the pictures here, that said the property could only be sold to white people. If someone tried to sell their house to a person who wasn't white, their neighbors could take them to court to stop the sale. And so these racial covenants created neighborhoods in Los Angeles where only white people could live, pushing minorities into certain areas and limiting their housing options. And this led to lasting racial divisions and made it hard for minorities to find good homes and build wealth. So this segregation led to concentrated areas of poverty and wealth poverty and lack of wealth with lasting effects on community resources and services. And so neighborhoods with racial covenants typically received more investment in infrastructure, schools, and public services, while minority neighborhoods were often neglected. And so what you see here is that these are a couple of the deeds. You'll see that the one on the left is actually for a house built in the 50s. And so you would think that, like, oh, racial covenants were just the early 1900s. We don't do that anymore, blah, blah, blah. But it's actually, again, not that far back if you think about it, right? So you'll see here that it says, like, shall ever be leased, sold, devised, conveyed, or otherwise inherited to people that they only can be Caucasian race. That's what these things said. You'd be surprised probably how many properties probably have these on the deeds. There are some folks that are going, the really sort of housing justice way and actually having it stricken from their deeds, things like that. But I'm sure that there are people that are living in homes that have these and don't even know. But these were a big problem and a big contribution to how our neighborhoods are set up now. Next, let's talk about redlining. So, I'm sure lots of people have heard of redlining, right? So we're just going to go over this quick so that way you understand how this all fits in. So redlining was a practice used by banks and insurance companies in the past to decide who could get loans and insurance. In Los Angeles County, redlining meant that certain areas, often where minorities lived, were marked in red on maps. And so this meant banks would not give loans to people in these redlined areas, making it hard for them to buy homes or improve their neighborhoods. For example, if a family wanted to buy a house in a redlined area, the bank would refuse to give them a mortgage, even if they could afford it. And this kept many minorities from owning homes and building wealth. It created and maintained this racial and economic segregation in Los Angeles that has lasting effects on the communities now. So these neighborhoods often remain under-resourced and face ongoing economic challenges. Okay. Um, you may are be interested in what this actually looks like, right? So we have a couple of descriptions, area descriptions using this redlining practice. This would be for a green area, which was like sort of the most desirable. It was also the most ethnically homogenous, which you could read as white and wealthy, to be fair. And this was often U.S. born, upper middle class neighborhood where quote unquote professional men lived. And so that is sort of like the most desirable, and that's where if you lived in those areas, you could get a bank, you could excuse me, you could get a loan, you could get insurance, so on and so forth, right? There's also a blue area which is still desirable. It's sort of established, most are nearly all white. It's still decent according to these standards, these very terrible standards. But yeah, and then we have redlining, the area description for red. And you see here, it's not just like white people are included. So I'm very cognizant of saying that redlining was about low income and minorities. And in some cases, I mean, most cases, those things intersect, right? And so you'll see that it actually addresses, oh, there's 15% foreign families, Orientals and Mexicans, really terrible language, old school stuff that luckily we don't use very much anymore. I hope nobody does anyway. And so this is what further created disparities in home ownership, just like we talked about, right? So if anyone lived in an area that was redlined and had this kind of description, banks, insurance companies were like, nah, we're running the other way, which is really, really unfortunate and super harmful. Next, zoning laws. So, zoning laws are rules set by cities to control how land can be used. In Los Angeles, zoning laws decide where homes, businesses, and factories can be built. These laws can also limit the type of housing allowed in certain areas, like only allowing single family homes and not apartments. So, exclusionary zoning is when these laws make it hard to build affordable housing or below market rate housing or multifamily units like apartment buildings. And in certain neighborhoods, this keeps lower income families and minorities out of those areas. So if a neighborhood is zoned only for single family homes, it's harder to build affordable apartments there. And so you'll see that with a single family home, it's most often denoted as an R1 in Los Angeles. There are other things like RE, which is like residential estate and stuff like that. If you want to learn more about zoning code, that's a different webinar, which we will have coming up here soon. But yeah, most common in Los Angeles is an R1. And that basically means that it's a single detached dwelling. It's one unit no matter how big the property size, right? So again, these zoning laws create and maintain segregation by keeping affordable housing out of many parts of Los Angeles. And so if you're thinking about like the West, like the along the coast and the West side, a lot of those places actually it's illegal to build any kind of multifamily housing, apartments, duplexes, condos, quadplexes, whatever you could, townhouses maybe. There's a lot of that stuff that is just outright illegal in those areas. You'll see that here is where it kind of started, these zoning laws. And in addition, so the redlining and the zoning laws sort of work together on this in a way, along with the racial covenants. These are early sort of things. Chris mentioned that he lives in Eagle Rock. I used to live in Eagle Rock. I believe we both went to, no, I went to Eagle Rock High School. Chris, what high school did you go to?
So I went to high school in New England, actually.
Oh, okay. But you're in Eagle Rock now, yes? Correct.
Mhm.
Okay, got it. So yeah, I love Eagle Rock. It was where I grew up, and it's a nice place. It has bad history, unfortunately. So you'll see that when the metropolitan urban areas in the early 1900s were sort of well, becoming metropolitan and urban, and there were a lot of mixed uses and diverse people. It was like, okay, well, the white wealthy people want somewhere else to go. They want to be somehow separated, and so these residential districts were created because of the sort of spoiled. They referred to like some of these metropolitan areas as spoiled, right? And so it was like protect your family. There are fixed and natural restrictions against the inroads of metropolitanism. And that was basically saying that, hey, we live up in the hills. You probably need a car to get there. And a lot of these other low income or minority folks don't have those. So just come here and everything can be white and right? Terrible, absolutely terrible. Oh my gosh. So, but you see that is the language. That was the sentiment. Not only was it allowed, but that sort of sentiment was shared for a while. And so it's bad. It's bad. Single family homes. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting a house. There's something wrong with making it so that way a certain group of people cannot live there. That's where the issue is. So let's talk about some of that impact. All right. So the legacy of inclusionary housing policies is evident in this continued segregation and inequality in housing markets. You might be thinking, no, this was a long time ago. It's not like that anymore. But the reality of it is that there are certain areas that are still concentrated areas of poverty, right? So you can tell by like certain places in South LA and East LA and other places like that, that they are still under-resourced areas. They often receive less funding and support, right? And so what we see is suburban sprawl, because if we're not building more dense housing, then we have to build out. So rather than build up and putting in, using all of the little space that might be available in sort of urban centers, then we are building out instead. And that's bad. We refer to that as suburban sprawl. Okay. What's suburban sprawl? Well, suburban sprawl is an uncontrolled expansion of urban areas into surrounding rural land. It's low density, it's car dependent, right? So there's not a lot of transit out into those areas and things like that. And often, and most of the time, and maybe all of the time, it is single family homes on large lots with wide roads. So what does that lead to? That leads to some economic consequences. There are higher costs. More infrastructure is needed, and there's an increase in maintenance costs. There's less efficient public services and higher public spending. All of that because it has to cover so much more area, right? Urban decay, because the investment usually follows those suburban areas, then the urban centers start to decay because they're not getting the kind of attention and funding that they need. So older infrastructure in those urban areas become underfunded and they kind of deteriorate. Um, and lastly, is social effects. So again, there's economic and racial segregation. And also, again, it encourages car dependency, which already we can see that because of greenhouse gas emissions, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit, but you can see that it also reduces physical activity and pollution related, excuse me, my dogs. There are pollution related health problems. And so what that might look like is here, minority and low income families likely to live with fewer resources and poorer health outcomes. So this is from a map tool on the internet called Not Even Past. It's a collaboration between the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab and the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And it basically is meant to show you that there's a higher prevalence of COVID-19 risk factors in historically redlined neighborhoods. And so they talk about this social vulnerability index, which is made up of various things, like whether you're a minority, if you experience poverty, If you have asthma, diabetes, high blood pressure, kidney disease, experience obesity or pulmonary disease, these are all a lot more prevalent in areas that were previously redlined. So, if you'd like to take it away, Chris, tell us about environmental impacts of housing.
All right. Thanks, Joshua. That was a terrific overview. And I kind of want to start it on a slide that builds on that point that redlining has this continuing effect. And so what I'm showing here on the screen, this is a snapshot from a New York Times article that shows redlined areas, not in LA, but in some other cities, and then compares it to the urban tree canopy. And so the darker shade essentially means greater tree canopy coverage. And you can see that there's the redlined areas have the fewest trees. And I think that is something that you can easily see if you look at LA as well. Neighborhoods like Koreatown or South LA are lacking in canopy cover compared to, let's just say, Beverly Hills as an example. And this is true for across other indicators, not listed here, but if you think about park access, if you think about exposure to pollution from highways and major roadways and industrial uses, the same pattern keeps showing up over and over again, both for the social side and the environmental indicators. And here's a picture. So this is kind of meant to spark discussion, and if anyone wants to pipe in here or insert into the chat, what do you see here in this Google Street View photo of Florence Firestone? What's happening in this picture? Well, I'm going to assume folks are.
Yeah, I was gonna say, feel free to unmute if you'd like to speak up, or go ahead and put it in the chat.
Well, I'm going to assume folks are fixing their sandwiches for lunch, and I'll start talking here. But you can imagine that if you're this person living in the residential home in the center part of this photograph, you're living right next to a manufacturing district, and so or a manufacturing building. And so you'll hear the noise of that activity throughout the day, which can be really disruptive. There will be trucks coming in and out, which is both a traffic safety hazard as well as having the air pollution effects of a diesel engine. You've got an auto dismantling shop across the street, which is going to give off dust, which is, more often than not, also leaching chemicals. And so you are exposed to these different polluters. And this is not the goal. We really don't want to be putting folks in harm's way, but this is what happened due to redlining. And so the neighborhoods that had that green or A grade, they had the political power to say no to these types of land uses. And so a lot of them ended up in the redlined areas in the communities of color. Okay, let's go to the next slide. All right, this is a different setting. This is in Santa Clarita, north of Los Angeles. And what do you see going on that's wrong with these land uses? Right? And on the one hand, it's a beautiful backdrop. I mean, that certainly is true. But to the point of suburban sprawl, this is what happens uh, when development occurs that is unchecked at the fringe of the urban area. And so what we have are these single family homes, which I'm sure are lovely inside, but there's nothing else. There's no shops, there's no restaurants. I don't see any schools or places to go shopping or parks. And so that means you have to get into your car if you want to access any of your daily destinations. There's a highway behind the homes there, and you're going to rack up the miles. And that's really what is so problematic about this type of exurban development. And I want to say here and like qualify that like this is not a dig at the city of Santa Clarita or the people who live here. This is the results of policy decisions that have forced this type of development, which is having a true environmental impact. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay, so um, energy efficiency is kind of a one to insert into the discussion, particularly around transportation, because a lot of why we care about infill development versus sprawl development is because of transportation impacts. And so this chart on the right, oh, we'll go back
Sorry, that
just a
was me.
slide.
My bad.
Oh, that's all right. I don't know if we. Oh, no, we're still going forward.
Hate this. It like won't go back. Hang on, let me fix this. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Live, folks. Live. Okay. It refuses to go back. I want to go back.
I
Okay,
think if
there
you.
we go. Okay, got
Okay. All right. Cool.
it.
All right. So on the right-hand side, this is basically like how many greenhouse gas or carbon emissions that are produced from traveling over a certain distance, over the same amount of distance. And so on the bottom, you'll see a gasoline engine car produces the most carbon emissions. That's probably to be expected. And then at the top, walking or biking has the fewest emissions. Also probably not surprising. But I think why the reason that I put this here is because a lot of people think that electric cars are the solution. And while they are an important technology evolution, it doesn't solve our climate problems altogether. So the electric car is right here below motorcycle or above motorcycle, uh, but right near it in terms of the emissions per mile. And that's because it takes a lot to produce the electricity that's used and stored in the battery. It takes a lot of energy to produce the vehicle itself. And so really, if we want to be having a smaller carbon footprint, we need to be thinking about walkable and bikeable communities and not just shifting everybody from car-centric, gas car-centric communities to electric car-centric communities. Okay, next slide. Another just idea that I wanted to insert here is that like let's just take the hypothetical of if we were living on an island and there were 100 families to house. Would you prefer to have your own uh, home with a backyard and little else, or would you prefer to have 100 apartments and preserve the pristine nature of that island? And I think most of us would choose the situation on the right. And so if we have to be thinking about conservation and infill development together, because that is one of the major environmental arguments for infill. Um, and so we have to be very considerate about where we choose to build and not to build. Okay, next. All right. I'm going to get into like a little bit of light technical discussion or numbers over the next few slides, but basically, where we live impacts our carbon footprint. And so the green here is like having a small carbon footprint. So if you live in Hollywood or Koreatown or downtown LA, chances are that you are walking or biking to go get a gallon of milk. You may hop on the subway to go to your job. That's at a downtown. And generally, the destinations are closer together. So even if you are driving, you're driving less. And so these are really the places that we want to be thinking about adding more housing from an environmental perspective. And you'll see some others here. I've highlighted downtown Culver City, Santa Monica. Actually, downtown Huntington Park is also another green spot here, and Glendale. And then if we zoom out on the next slide, and really put this in the perspective of the region. We have to think about where to place homes in the region because people choose where to live based on their ability to commute to work. And if we can't afford to live close to where we work, people tend to spread out. And then you get something like the Santa Clarita single family home development, which we discussed a little bit earlier as having a larger environmental footprint. Let's go to the next slide. And just to give a sense of what this looks like on a household level, this is a snapshot that I made using the Cool Climate Calculator, which is a tool developed by researchers at UC Berkeley. And it's pretty neat. You can go in there and like insert your family size and income level and like how much you drive per year and like a number of different variables and actually calculate your own household footprint. But this just is using the generic set of assumptions. And so for a typical LA household of median income, this is where the greenhouse gas emissions are produced. Travel is the largest bar here, and you see that this assumes like a gasoline car. The next is the energy that is associated with your home, so the electricity that you use, the water that you use, and the gas that's used to both heat your home and the water and cook and all of these things. You have a food footprint. It's for another day, but plant-based diets are very good for the for climate reasons. And then there are the goods and services that we consume. And then compare this to the next slide, which is going to show you a typical Santa Clarita home. And again, apologies for picking on Santa Clarita, but just as an illustrative example, the footprint is quite a bit larger, more than 50% larger at 60 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. And now the scale on the y-axis is different. So I tried to, on the very next slide, show you how these compare. But basically, take this dotted line, and the dotted line is the same for both. It's 7 tons of carbon emissions for food. So that bar is the same. And then what you see is that in comparison to that food line in Santa Clarita, every other bar is higher. The travel emissions are way higher. The home emissions are larger because the homes tend to be larger and they don't have the benefits of living in an apartment building. And then more goods and services are also consumed. So you've got more house, you have more furniture to put in it, and so forth. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And this is a pattern that we see everywhere. So the outer suburbs have about 50% higher emissions per household, and that's after adjusting for income. And the same is true in these other examples from DC, Chicago, and Dallas. I say adjusted for income because typically higher income households have larger emissions. They have more cars. They have more stuff that requires electricity, and they have bigger homes that take more energy to heat and cool. But even when adjusting for that, you have to drive further in the outer suburbs. Okay, next one. And so what's the biggest solution that we can pursue to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? Well, in most places, that's thinking about urban infill or reducing vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. This is another output from the Cool Climate Calculator that makes recommendations to cities and towns about the most effective strategies that they can pursue to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And here in LA and Pasadena, that's directly related to housing. The other stuff here tends to get more attention in environmental circles, including commercial energy efficiency, switching to heat pumps, moving to electric vehicles. All that stuff definitely matters, but really thinking about transportation and urban infill is the big ticket. Okay. And then I just dropped a few book covers here because I sometimes get asked about about resources to recommend. So if you're interested in diving more into these topics, The Color of Law is really detailed on redlining, and particularly in Los Angeles. Strong Towns has a terrific educational material that they post on social media. Intersectional Environmentalists is near and dear to me as well. So these are just a few that I would suggest for folks who want to dive in further.
And I just want to throw in real quick that Abundant Housing LA is working on a book club. And I believe the first book that we're going to be doing is actually the follow-up to The Color of Law, which is Just Action. It's same author and his daughter. And we had a book talk with her last year. So if you're interested in that, stay tuned. All right. So next, Kat, would you like to take it away?
Sure. And I'm also gonna like second the intersectional environmentalist. Like Leah Thomas's book is probably like the reason why I feel like a lot of the work that we do should not be siloed, but more intersectional, because like you can't advocate for one thing without really taking into mind or consideration the ways that like things move together with different moving parts, and nothing ever moves on its own. So just want to second that book, and I would be so excited for this book club. Um, but wanted to move into a little bit more about like the climate science and how it affects like urban settings more specifically. I know that Chris gave us a lot of really good information on like the difference and like the discrepancies that happen between like suburban sprawl and then urban areas and like the benefits of that. So I want to go into a little bit more about that in the next slide. Talking a little bit more about those climate impacts. I mean, how many of us have not seen these crazy headlines about like there is like record-breaking temperatures almost every day? Like that is incredibly insane to me to think about, because sometimes like it doesn't affect us on a day-to-day like scale, but we'll think, you know what, maybe it is a little hotter today, maybe it is a little bit more humid. But if we think about it in terms of like the context in which this is happening, where like even in my own neighborhood, I remember when I was a kid, we didn't really experience humidity. I didn't know what humidity was. And now it's humid all the time. And like that in itself being representative of like the impacts that we're feeling over the course of time, right? And so we're seeing there's like a rise in not just temperatures, but also like extreme weather effects, right? We're seeing more hurricanes because of temperature changes. We're seeing like warmer winters. We're seeing colder, you know, winters as well in other places. And a lot of that is because of this impact that's coming across the globe. And then across even the United States, there's been a lot that has changed over the past few years. And we're getting closer and closer to this, like, well, maybe you know, the impacts that we can't stop those anymore. We've passed that threshold. We know that temperature is going to keep rising globally. So now what can we do to get our communities adapting and able to sustain these changes in temperature? Like we know we can't stop this, it's inevitable. What can we do now? It's less about stopping it and more about adapting, mitigating, and being more resilient to these changes. Next slide. And so even in California here, we like have some examples of like how California is being impacted by climate change. Like I said, extreme heat days is the top thing, but that also impacts air quality. You know, as temperatures rise, like roads are even worse, like those impacts of like carbon emissions, those impacts of like diesel, you know, VOX, like all of those are impacting urban areas. We also see an increase in wildfires. The air gets drier in certain places. We're not maintaining it appropriately. That could be another conversation for another day on how we do urban forest management. But all of that impacts we're feeling those more in California. We're also seeing heavier rains where we're not supposed to be seeing these types of like heavier rains. We had drought before. I heard that it's weird to think, but I heard like the past few years were like the first time we weren't technically not in a drought. But we also have really poor stormwater management like sort of systems in place. So even though it's raining more, we're not collecting as much of that water because of the way that urban cities are created, the way that they're paved, the way that they're built. And so trying to do this like balance of both hard infrastructure, meaning more like pavements, buildings and all of that, that we also want to be elevating using like more nature-based solutions as well, trying to do more like rain gardens instead of lawns, since lawns tend to be more conducive to using water use versus like rain gardens that tend to be more about absorbing and collecting that water and cleaning that water up. And so there's a lot more that goes into that. And then the last piece, of course, sea level rise. As it gets hotter, the sea starts to rise, and that makes areas that are more prone to flood risk even more impacted as temperatures keep going up. So there's a variety of ways that like the state of California is being impacted, being a coastal state, but also the urban areas, because, you know, as people start to move away from the coast because of sea level rise, you start to get more of an increase in populations in more of the urban areas. And if we're not creating enough homes that are climate resilient to this population change, like that's going to be an impact. And then already we don't have enough affordable homes. I don't want to say homes in general. I want to say affordable homes for a community that already exists in urban areas. And then add on top of that, any sort of migration patterns, we're going to see even more impacts. So this is just like overlaying all of the different pieces that go in to this. Next slide. And so for urban areas specifically, we have this thing called like the urban heat island effect. And basically what that means is that urban areas tend to have more like surfaces that are hard surfaces, like asphalt being the number one. And then we have buildings and we have pavement that still has a lower ability to remove heat from urban areas than nature-based solutions like rain gardens, like we talked about, even grass sometimes, and then more or less trees and other parts of other types of greenery that exists, including like urban parks that could also help improve reducing temperatures in urban areas. And so what the urban heat island effect gets at is that if we're not balancing the amount of pavements or the amount of asphalt that exists with the amount of sources that can help us cool down our cities, we're only going to retain this heat in urban areas, and it's just going to get worse with this temperature increasing. So one of the best ways to think about this is like, okay, during the day, it's really hot already because temperatures are going up. We're feeling the heat, and then you would think, okay, at night, the sun goes down, it should cool down. But it doesn't. Why does that happen in urban areas? It happens because these surfaces tend to retain that heat that then gets re-released at night when stuff is supposed to be cooling down. So now you're getting days where you're like maybe in the hundreds degrees Fahrenheit, and then you're also getting nights where you're like still in the 80, 90s range of degree Fahrenheit. So you're never getting an opportunity to cool down. And a lot of that is because we're seeing this this increase in the amount of pay services. And so what Climate Resolve, for example, likes to do, and we do a lot of our advocacy around, is that sometimes you do need those paved ways, you do need those roads, you do need those houses, you do need those buildings. But is there a way that we can make sure that we are reflecting some of that heat back into the atmosphere and helping cool down those cities that have these paved surfaces? And we use cool roofs as an example. Cool roofs became an ordinance in the city of Los Angeles back in 2013. Climate Resolve helped lead that basically requires that a lot of these roofs that tend to be really hot, we are going to cool those down and make sure that they're using technologies and materials that can help keep those roofs cool. It's not just about helping reduce the urban heat island effect in that case. Having a cooler roof means that the building itself will stay cooler, which means that if you're in that building, you'll have less of a need to use your air conditioning system, which means that you'll feel cooler without having to use all that energy and pay that bill. And all of that then has like all of these almost ripple effects of less air AC usage means less of a strain on our grid, meaning that there's less of an opportunity for that neighborhood or city to have like a brownout or a blackout. But then also it helps like for residents who cannot afford to use ACs or to pay that electricity bill, it reduces your need for doing that. And so oftentimes, even if it's hot, like we've heard from residents who would rather stay hot and suffer through that in their apartment than pay for that because they can't. They literally cannot afford to pay these bills. And so by using these kinds of things of like cool roofs, for example, we're able to cool down buildings and neighborhoods without really necessarily having to do this like bigger transition to like, let's go back to just green. We have to sort of work with our existing environment and move from there. And so we're seeing that the urban heat island effect doesn't, that was one example, but there's also still impacts from extreme heat that affect public health. And public health is huge. We want to make sure that we're protecting our populations that are most vulnerable to that, which include like kids, include our seniors, include anybody who has existing or pre-existing health conditions that can be made worse because of these rising temperatures. And so if you already come into a city, you're moving in, you have asthma, or you have an existing heart disease, you're going to feel that even worse. There's not your environment is not going to allow you to really thrive in it if we're not keeping in mind the things that you need on an environment scale to help you have a high quality life. So the urban heat island effect is just one of the things that affects urban areas, especially nowadays with climate change exacerbating those impacts. Next slide. And so now we've learned about like climate change, and we've learned about the different impacts, and we've learned about urban areas, and we've learned about straw. But there's then, how do we tie the two things, right? Like we said, intersection is incredibly important. How does climate change affect our housing stock? And so these are also, again, some like titles that we're seeing of extreme weather events like wildfires, and how they're destroying homes across the country because we're not adapting to being able to deal with wildfires. And we're seeing that the other thing that's also occurring is that in California, and even in Los Angeles more specifically, there are a lot of communities that have this old housing stock that was never retrofitted or made more adaptable or resilient to these impacts that we're having. So now you have these homes that never got those retrofits to be more energy efficient. They never got those retrofits that are needed to help prevent these impacts from occurring. And so you're now seeing that a lot of these houses are now going into disrepair at a far faster rate than they are being retrofitted. And so even in Los Angeles, you're getting reports of like mold and like insect infestations with these rising temperatures. You have appliances that are not getting replaced and that are not energy efficient. And conditions are becoming so bad that oftentimes like residents have no choice but either leave those conditions and be forced out of their communities and try to find somewhere else that has better living conditions. It could be even further out. And so you're seeing now there's like forced migration from residents in the communities that they've lived in their whole lives, be forced out of them in search of more affordable housing that has better living conditions. And so it creates this connection between like living conditions and housing insecurity. Just because you have a home or an apartment to live in doesn't mean that like you actually have habitable living conditions. And there's a lot of research now that shows the connection between indoor air quality and other indicators of like building performance that are also linked to medical conditions and costs and well-being. And climate change is only going to create conditions that increase those health hazards. And then it's just like gonna keep piling on. So this is one of those things that like we can't just build new housing. We have to make sure that we're also retrofitting housing that's already out there. So keeping this in mind, there's generally two ways that we can tackle this issue. And then the first is building more climate resilient housing. And then the other, like I said, is to make sure that we're retrofitting existing housing that's already out there. So next slide. And so when it comes to like building housing, we have to keep these three like different things in mind, like affordability, planning, and transportation, right? It's important. And Chris talked a lot about this when he was talking about like how housing can sometimes exist next to industry and other things that make your conditions worse. So we have to keep in mind that when we're building new housing, it's important to keep that away from pollution sources. It's important to keep that away from like climate hazards. So it could be either flood risk zones, it could be zones that are vulnerable to fires and wildfires, and then moving that housing to be near transit and jobs so that folks can spend either less time needing to drive to work or be able to access transit that can get them to work. But, you know, again, going back to the intersection, is that we can't only ask for housing to be built near transit when the public transit is not on par with the quote unquote convenience of driving. Like, would you rather spend 45 minutes in traffic or have to spend 2 hours in public transit? Like, it doesn't make public transit appealing to folks when they see the inconvenience that could come from like poor system service, unsafe systems. And so infill housing and transit improvements have to go hand in hand together, because even if you build this infill housing, then you'll have more people in the same community living closer together and going the same routes when transit's not a good option. So it only increases like population that will be living in the same spaces if transit is not getting the same sort of investment and advocacy that we need to be able to do those things cohesively and together. And so as we build more housing, the last component that goes into it is that we need to make sure that it's actually affordable, and that, you know, it's actually made, this housing is being built for those who most need it. And one of the like big things that I feel like oftentimes we know about it, and it's one of those things that's a lived experience, but we don't actually have like the term for it, is this idea of being rent burdened. A lot of people think, you know, I pay X amount of money for my paycheck to rent because that's how it's always been. And I've always done that, and I've always coped and I made it work. But the idea of like being rent burdened, which to define, is spending more than 30% of your income on just rent. Like there are crazy amounts of people who spend more than half of their paycheck on just rent, which is ridiculous, because then you have other expenses that you need to do. You have to buy food. If you're a family of, you know, with any kids, then you have to have childcare. You have to be able to like have enough time to go do all of that. And if you're having to spend more time trying to work to be able to afford not just your rent, your food, your childcare, transportation expenses, everything that goes into that, and you're spending most of your paycheck on just rent, the idea of being rent burdened is crazy. So we need to make sure that when we're saying affordable, that it's as close to affordable for the community it's meant to be, and that it's better to use more local and neighborhood-based income sort of levels when we're talking about AMI, which is the average median income, versus citywide. Because we'll see in, like, for example, Los Angeles, the median income is like 50K. But we have communities like Boyle Heights, which is in Los Angeles, where their median income is like barely 40K. And so that $10,000 goes, it's a huge difference. And if you're saying that you want to build affordable housing developments that are meant to fit a certain amount of people, it's still not going to be affordable, even if it is deemed affordable. So that's just the spiel on building housing. The other side of the coin is retrofitting housing. So next slide. So the other thing that comes into mind is like then building efficiency and like decarbonization into the housing that already exists. Residential building decarbonization measures are incredibly vital to addressing climate change. They help us make sure that our appliances are energy efficient. It means that you're spending less money on any electricity bill. If it means, like I said, like cool roofs, adding either solar, all of that feels like it can make sure that you're helping be more climate resilient and your home can last longer. But with sometimes building decarbonization or doing these types of retrofits, they can also lead to measures of like eviction, harassment, rent burden, and displacing working class renters if the right safeguards are not in place. So we know that evictions and displacement not only destroy lives, families, and communities, but they perpetuate sprawl and increase carbon emissions, which undermines the whole purpose of us being able to do this in the first place, to achieve those meaningful greenhouse gas reductions. And so we want to make sure that when these retrofits are occurring, that we're not increasing yet another obstacle for families to deal with evictions or illegal harassment or things like that. And so, we want to make sure that as we're doing decarbonization, which is like using and switching from like fossil fuels, like your gas stove into like an electric stove, that we're making sure that this is occurring in places with the proper safeguards and protections in place for tenants who are doing that. And one of the ways that we do that today, and you can continue advocating for this if you're interested, is with organizations that are working already to target some of these concerns, like the Our Future LA Coalition, which is next slide, who is doing a lot of great work in Los Angeles. Like Our Future LA is made up of like a lot of nonprofits, community advocates, and people in general from the community who want to be able to address that intersection between like what do we need to do to build affordable housing that's climate resilient, but also affordable housing that's affordable, and then also protecting our tenants who don't want to have to leave their communities to access better homes. A lot of times we say, let's build in communities like the West Side that have all of these resources already. But we have community members who are like, you know what, I've spent my whole life in Boyle Heights. I don't want to move there, even if it means I'll get access to more of these resources. My history is here. I want to stay here. And that person deserves as much of a right to be protected and to be offered safeguards to be able to stay there and have a high quality life. And so Our Future LA aims at targeting a lot of these different intersections and has a lot of partners who do the various types of work needed in there. And yes, Abundant Housing LA is on there. I didn't add the logos because I was going to say that. And then yes, Urban Environmentalists are part of the square, as well as like other smaller consultants who offer their time and expertise to the work that we're doing. And so next slide. So here we have like some of the policy impacts. Two big wins that have come out of doing this type of coalition work that is needed to be able to not just build and like protect these homes is the LA County Affordable Housing Solutions Agency, known as La CASA, if you've heard of it. It's a regional organization, so it's meant to be the agency for LA County. And then it was created to make sure that housing is more affordable. It's meant to help people stay in their homes and increase housing options for people experiencing homelessness. Right now, a lot of the ways that we deal with housing is very siloed. Different organizations or agencies within the city and county tend to do only different pieces. Like if you're talking about tenant harassment, you have to go to building services. If you're talking about affordability and building it, you have to go to a different department. And there hasn't been an agency that's able to like be that on top part, like the umbrella for that. And so this agency is meant to be that. This agency is meant to like help us like build the housing that we need to do. And that means like managing the funding to make sure that the housing projects that are being funded are actually affordable, and making sure that there is also what's the word, enforcement of things. Just because a policy is put in place doesn't mean that there's the proper enforcement in place to make sure that there's a follow through there. This agency is meant to do all of that. And so that was one of the big wins that we've got across at the county scale. And then going into the city scale, the measure ULA, which is United to House LA, was another scale, another win for the city. And you might know this one as the mansion tax, but it's meant to tax properties that or real estate sales, I should say sales, more than anything that are over $5 million. It's a 4% tax on properties that are sold or transferred for more than 5 million. And then it goes up to about a 5.5% tax on properties that are sold or transferred for more than 10 million. And all of this funding is meant to be able to come back and fund housing. It's meant to fund services. And some of just like to this day, there has been over $200 million that have been raised, where about 4,500 households were receiving financial support through this measure for rent. There's also been 11,000 tenants who have received emergency rental assistance. There was an investment of about $55 million for 9 large-scale affordable housing projects, where 40% of those units will be permanent supportive housing for folks in transition. And then already from those projects, 4 of them are under construction. You might have also heard that there were a lot of lawsuits trying to make sure that this measure didn't pass through, and that the funding was not going to go through, but all of those were defeated. So Measure ULA is here to stay, and we'll continue doing the good work that we needed to do. And then next slide, the last bit that I have for you all is upcoming policy. All of this is on the ballot for this November 2024. Measure A is another initiative being led by our Future LA, the coalition. It stands for the Affordable Housing, Homelessness Solutions, and Prevention Now initiative. It's citizen-led, and it focuses on creating more affordable housing, expanding services, which are important. Right now, there's a lack of funding that's going to services that are needed to help folks who are dealing with homelessness to be able to get access to the services that they need to have a high quality life, and to be able to fight whatever the impacts are, the factors are that are keeping them on the street. And so it's meant to also fund mental health and addiction services for our unhoused population. What that really means is that it'll be a half-cent sales tax that'll replace an existing quarter-cent sales tax. So it's only gone up a quarter cents, and it won't apply to essentials like groceries, EBT purchases, medicine, diapers, rent, and gas. It's meant to really hit those folks who can afford to be taxed with the things that they need to tax. And so this measure is really important. This would be the funding mechanism for the La Casa agency that I just spoke about. It'll help make sure that there's funding coming through, like a consistent source of funding to be able to do the goals that that agency was built out to do. And then the last piece that I want to share with you all today that's also going to be on the ballot for November is the Justice for Renters Act. It will repeal the Costa-Hawkins Act. For those of you who don't know what I can never say this, Costa-Hawkins, the words blur in my mouth. But it basically means that right now with Costa-Hawkins, it forces cities to not be able to decide for themselves what sort of rent control and tenant protections can go in place, and it forces those cities with rent control to let vacant units go to market rates. And with market rates right now at record levels, vacancy decontrol gives landlords huge incentives to empty apartments somehow. So if it means if you're not living in a place that has good habitability and you're being forced to move because they're not investing in your home, they're able to then take that unit and put it back at market value. They can go in and fix it up, but then they'll sell it or put it at rent 2 times as much as you were paying. And it's forcing people to really have to be evicted for market value. And so once vacated, even affordable housing apartments can lose their affordability forever because there is no way to really protect that. And so the Justice for Renters Act will help repeal this Costa-Hawkins Act and let local cities and counties decide democratically whether they want to maintain, enact, or expand rent control, whatever basically works for them. It gives them more autonomy to make these types of decisions, which is very much needed as we're building more affordable housing. We have to be able to protect it. And so those are my 2 cents for today. Please, in November, vote for Measure A and the Justice for Renters Act. They're incredibly important for affordability for our housing today and tomorrow and forever, future generations.
Thank you, Kat. I feel like I learned so much. Chris, would you like to take it away?
Sure. All right. So I'm going to talk about some of the things, some of the solutions that we're advocating for. But before I get to those, I wanted to just actually present a few housing developments that I like and think we should be moving towards this kind of vision. So the first one that I point to for people in LA is Village Green. If you haven't been there, this is in Baldwin Hills. There are 629 condos on 64 acres, and it's like one of the greenest places in LA. Part of that is because they have access to a private aquifer, but also because they're very intentional in design. So cars, there are parking spaces, but they're on the periphery of the property. So what you have basically is like this large open green space, and you'll see kids running around and biking around, like without fear of traffic or anything. It's walking distance, the E line. I think it's just terrific, and we could use more spaces like this. That one was from 1941. Why don't we go to the next slide, something a little bit more contemporary. This is Ivy Station in Culver City. This was completed just a few, ooh, there goes my light. This was completed just a few years ago. It's right next to an E-line stop, and it is a mixture of uses. This is what we want to see, to have people out and about and activate public space at all times of the day. You see here, this is a dance social that occurred, and they have concerts and movie series and all kinds of other stuff. And then a little bit further afield is this is in Tempe, Arizona, and just opened last year. And I'm trying to schedule a visit to go out here, but it's a car-free community. It's not too far from downtown. It's on a light rail. It's going to house 1,000 people when it's all said and done, and they have all kinds of mobility solutions, including discounts if you want to take a car someplace or rent a bike or a scooter. Okay, so a few things that we can do, legalizing and streamlining infill housing. So we're thinking about how do we make it possible to build multifamily and mixed use developments like the ones we saw on the prior screens, which are not allowed in many places in our city and region. And then also making it much easier to build in historically exclusionary neighborhoods that tried, where there's a legacy of trying to keep people out. Next slide. Certainly supporting transportation alternatives. This means pedestrian and bike infrastructure. It's mixed use zoning so that you actually have places to walk to and have eyes on the street. Public transit improvements, a lot of focus on transit only lanes or bus rapid transit. And then another piece of this is parking mandates. So there are currently ordinances on the books that require a certain number of parking spaces to be built, whether future residents use them or not. And there's a lot of evidence from research showing that if you actually just remove these altogether and let the home builders decide how much parking to build, then it makes it much easier for them to build affordably because they don't have to pay for the construction of unnecessary parking spaces. And it makes residents consider alternatives such as using car share and maybe not owning a private vehicle. Next slide. Urban greening. There are many dimensions to this. I list a few here from tree and vegetation planting and maintenance advocacy. We are shifting as a region to more green stormwater infrastructure. I list here some of the recent voter initiatives, as well as increasing access to parks, beaches, and open space, and community gardens. And I'm keeping an eye on the clock because I do want to get to the end and have at least a little time for discussion here. So let's keep moving. So the Los Angeles County has a sustainability plan, which I happen to have the pleasure of being the consultant project manager for when it came out 6 years ago. Under goal 3, there are all these strategies that align with all of the things we've been discussing today. And the county's been moving forward on some of these and maybe not as quickly on others. The plan is being updated in the next year or two. I would say over the next year. So let's keep an eye out for this because this is a perfect opportunity to participate in that stakeholder engagement process. Next slide. For City of LA residents and stakeholders. There's something called the Citywide Housing Incentive Program, or CHIP, which might be a little easier to think about. But this is really focusing on some citywide incentives about where we want to encourage housing. And so what we're really trying to do, or what the city is trying to do, is focus new housing to be built in high opportunity areas that have those shops, that have high quality schools and parks and transit access and all these things. And they also want to strengthen tenant protections and make sure that we're locating housing near jobs and transit and away from environmentally hazardous areas. All great. Like, these are exactly what we want to be moving towards. But the problem, next slide, is that the way that this has been proposed is that no single family zones are going to have to change one bit. Doesn't matter if they are right next to transit, which we have some instances of those on the west side. They've been excluded, and they've been excluded because there is pressure coming from certain city council offices. And so this is something that we have been focusing on over the last several weeks, and will continue to do so throughout the rest of the year, because without opening up all of that urban land, almost 80% of the city of LA is zoned for single family. We're not going to be able to address our environmental and housing challenges. Okay, back to you, Joshua.
All right. So, that was all amazing. I hope that everybody here now and watching in the future really takes in a lot of this stuff. So I think that now is a little bit. Oh my gosh, I apologize for my clumsiness with the technology today. It's just that kind of day, I guess. But yeah, I think that we'd like to take questions and maybe also just talk about how, like, we've talked about how, like, housing and climate are intersected already, but using housing as a climate strategy, like, how do we do that, right? And I actually have a question for both of you, or either one of you who would like to answer. Something that I hear a lot when we sometimes advocate for, like, more density and apartments or whatever that looks like, I always hear the question, well, how are we going to get water and power there? How are we going to do those things? And so I'm wondering, from y'all's perspectives, like, what is the answer to that?
Wow, that's a big one for a 101. That might be a 201 seminar. But
Fair, fair.
water supply is a huge challenge for us, and the reality is that our population is way larger than we would have been able to support with the resources that exist in our region. And so we do have to import water from the Colorado River and from the Owens Valley, in order to sustain our human population. That being said, there's a lot of work being done now to think about how do we really make the most of our local water sources? How can we capture more of the water that is, processed at our wastewater facility and use it maybe for potable uses or non-potable uses? How do we stop using so much outdoor water to, for lawns and other things that aren't really used for functional purposes? That's a big piece of the question. And and then on the power side, we're also thinking a lot of these solutions, and Kat spoke to some of these already, but if we're thinking about reducing heat island and making buildings more efficient in general, where that requires less energy in the first place. So we're reducing the need to build new infrastructure and new generation, from faraway places, and that's all important. And infill homes have a smaller footprint to begin with. So really, this is um, it's there are trade-offs, but the trade-offs for building in infill locations is way better than in sprawl locations.
So, Pat, do you have anything to add to that before we move on to another question?
Yeah, I mean, Chris covered it all. Yeah, for me, I was thinking more like powers. Like, I know that we're especially switching to the like generation of like electric vehicles, and like oftentimes the grid might not be ready right now to be able to handle all of that charging. And so I think, it's not just about like saying like let's do EV and like convert everything to EV right now, because that's the upgrading that's going to be needed for our infrastructure that already exists, that transfers all this power to us, is not going to be ready by the time we're going to ask the demand for it to happen. So it's oftentimes for me, it's like, why are we advocating just for EV? Like, let's advocate for better public transit. Let's advocate for more biking, walking, and all of those things go hand in hand, because you can ask for all of the EV cars you want, but if the grid is not ready to handle that charging, what are folks not going to do? They're
Yeah.
not going to drive. So we need to invest in our public transit system, to make sure that our transit system is able to support those who like may not afford to get an EV vehicle, or may not be in a community that's being like prioritized right now for those types of like infrastructure improvements for the grid. So I think, a lot of times, like, I just want to advocate for people to just like not use their cars. And there's definitely other ways to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that Chris might be right that that probably deserves its own sort of like webinar. But I think the reason why I really wanted to bring it up is because you see a lot of these big headlines of like, oh, this car maker vows to have all electric cars by 20 something and things like that. And I think that it gives us this very high level sort of far away goal, and people are just like, well, what does that mean, right? And so yeah, it's I think it can leave room for a lot of misinterpretation and like and misinformation like with that kind of stuff. So thank you so much for those answers. Anders has a question. He says, how do we hold city and county leaders accountable in executing their sustainability and housing plans?
I mean, the organizer in me says like show up. Like, honestly, like a lot of that is being informed. It's like sharing this information. Like, now you have it. You have you're here today, which means like you want to learn more about it. I would say like tell people more about this. There's community, or not community, sorry, like city meetings. Oftentimes when we talk about budget's a huge thing. Sometimes they'll say, you know what, we can't actually execute or like meet the goals of our plan because there's no money going in. If you're in LA City, I would say follow our what is his name? Kevin Mejia, who's like doing a lot as the city accountant, and he's just like been sharing a lot of information about transparency across like how budget is being spent down. So I would say like be involved in those places. Support organizations that do that type of advocacy already. It could look like abundant housing. It could look like urban environmentalists, climate resolve, our future LA. Like, there's a lot of organizations already out there, and a lot of times we just need people to show up with us when we're doing meetings at the city, meetings for the county, with La Casa coming through, like all of that. So because you can try to like talk to your leaders directly as well, and sometimes like a lot of those, if it's just you, it might not have that big impact. So if you get your community mobilized and all of you all send comment cards, they send public, go show up and do public comment, they can't ignore that. So a lot of it is just mobilization, for me, for my organizer brain to like think through that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll throw in there that anyone who's watching this, if you're like, but I don't really know what to say, like at public comments, I don't know what to do, like we will help you with that. I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure any one of these organizations, any one of the organizations on the Future LA, our Future LA slide, we would definitely help you with that. So if you're just not sure where to start, just sign up on our mailing list or something, and you'll see when we have like an event that says, "Hey, here's how you make public comment," or here's how you do this and that. So perfect. Anything else about that specifically? No? Any other questions that we have? You could have a few moments maybe to get those questions in your brain working. We do have just a couple other slides, not like sort of informational, but so just everyone who attends and RSVPs will get this slide deck. So this is our information if you want to contact any of us. So that's there for you. And also just to thank you. And these are our like respective organizations' websites. And I tried very specifically to get the page where you can go and sign up for the newsletter easily. So there is on the Urban Environmentalist site, that is on the main page there. So you just got to scroll down a little bit. But yeah, I think that that's also one of the best ways to keep like our elected officials accountable is to be involved with these organizations like this, like Kat was saying. So this is a great way to make sure you can be involved is to sign up for those newsletters. There's lots of advocacy opportunities. There's other educational opportunities. So really, we hope that you go do that. And finally, or close to finally, I think this is the second to last thing. Chris talked about CHIP earlier, the Citywide Housing Incentive Plan. And so this is a link. Actually, I'm gonna see if I can get that into the chat, um, where you can actually write to your legislator and be like, "Hey, we want this to go a certain way, right? We want things like the exclusion of single family zones and things like that to be considered and changed, right? So there's lots of stuff that we want to do. So we really hope that you can be part. This is one of the things that you could do to like keep people accountable is to fill out things like this, forms like this. So we hope you can check that out. And finally, soon, actually, why don't you go ahead, Chris? You talk about this.
We've been working on writing all of this down, all of these ideas down. And so we've got a white paper that is in its like 99% draft form right now, and we'll be releasing it in the next couple of weeks. And we will have a launch event in person a couple Saturdays from now at Lehrer Architects Studio in Silver Lake.
Yeah, that's going to be a good one. It'll be a great panel. We've got some fantastic guests. Oh my gosh. Oh, it's because I'm rolling with the roll thing. Okay. This whole time I was like, why is it moving slides? I didn't click it. Okay. Yeah, it's gonna be a great event. There will be snacks and stuff like that. But yeah, go to tinyurl.com/housing for climate and RSVP for that. That is like Chris said, a couple of Saturdays away. It will be a great time. And also, Lehrer Architect Studio is beautiful. It lets in this like gorgeous heavenly natural light that when I saw it for the first time I was in awe. I was like, ah. So great venue too, so that's going to be fantastic. I think that's all we have. Are there any other questions or anything that any folks might have? Anders and Diana, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for the question, Anders. Anything else? Because we are at time. All right.
Great presentation. Thank you so much for all of the information and all of your time.
Of course, of course. Thank you. And thank you, Chris and Kat. You are rock stars. So thank you so much for doing this with us. And I look forward to collaborating in the future in various ways. I hope everyone has a fantastic weekend, month, whenever you're watching this. I hope you're filled with joy and comfort. And let's work. Let's do the work. Let's fix Los Angeles if we can. Bye, y'all. Have a great one.
Thanks, Joshua. Thanks, Chris. Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
All right,
everyone.
thanks, you
Bye-bye.
all. Take care.